The morning sun cast long shadows across Clearwater Valley when Tom Harrison heard the gunshots echoing from the creek. What he discovered there would change his life forever and challenge everything his community believed about honor, courage, and the true meaning of humanity. By sunset the next day, the sight that greeted him would leave him speechless, as over 100 wild stallions thundered across his land, led by riders who had come to settle a debt that no one expected. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1887, and Clearwater Valley stretched endlessly under the Montana sky, where cattle grazed on grasslands that seemed to roll on forever. Tom Harrison had built his life here, carved it from nothing with calloused hands and an unshakable belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. His ranch, Sunrise Ranch, sat nestled between two ridges where the creek wound its way through cottonwood trees that had stood long before the first settlers arrived. Tom was a man of few words but strong convictions. At 42, his weathered face told the story of countless dawns spent in the saddle, fixing fences, birthing calves, and wrestling with the endless challenges that came with raising livestock. On the frontier, his hands were rough from rope and leather, his back slightly bent from years of lifting hay bales and wrestling steers. But his eyes, pale blue like the winter sky, held a kindness that his neighbors in Willowbrook had come to respect, even if they didn't always understand his decisions. Sarah, his wife of 16 years, possessed the strength that kept frontier families together when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. She could deliver a calf, bake bread for 20 ranch hands, and teach their daughter Anna to read by candlelight, all in the same day. Her auburn hair, now streaked with premature silver, was always pulled back in a practical bun, but her smile could light up their modest homestead like summer lightning. Anna, their 13-year-old daughter, had inherited her father's quiet determination and her mother's fierce loyalty. She moved through their world with the confidence of someone who had never known life beyond the valley, someone who believed that goodness and hard work would always triumph over hatred and fear. She spent her days helping with chores, reading the few books that made their way to their remote corner of Montana, and dreaming of adventures beyond the horizon. The morning started like any other. Tom rose before dawn, as was his custom, and stepped onto the porch of their log home to breathe in the crisp mountain air. The coffee Sarah had prepared steamed in his hands as he watched the sun gradually paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. Cattle dotted the pasture like scattered stones, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the gentle whinny of horses in the corral. His favorite mount, Thunder, a magnificent black stallion with a white blaze down his face, grazed peacefully near the fence. Tom had raised Thunder from a colt, and the horse had become more than just a working animal. He was a companion, a trusted partner in the daily rhythm of ranch life. Thunder could read Tom's intentions before Tom himself knew what he wanted to do, could navigate the roughest terrain without stumbling, and possessed an intelligence that sometimes seemed almost human. The day's work began as it always did. Tom saddled Thunder and rode out to check the fences along the eastern boundary, where the creek meandered through a section of land that always seemed to need attention. The wire had a tendency to sag there, probably from deer crossing or the occasional bear that wandered down from the mountains. It was routine work, the kind that allowed his mind to wander while his hands stayed busy. The creek ran clear and cold, fed by mountain springs that never seemed to diminish even in the driest summers. Willows grew thick along its banks, creating shaded pools where trout hid during the heat of the day. Tom had always loved this section of his land, not just for its beauty, but for the peace it offered. Here, away from the demands of town and the complications of dealing with neighbors, he could think clearly. That's when he heard the shots. 3 sharp cracks echoed across the valley, followed by shouts and the sound of horses moving fast through the brush. Tom pulled Thunder too. Stopped and listened intently. The sounds were coming from upstream, perhaps half a mile away, where the creek curved around a bend thick with cottonwoods. His first instinct was to ride toward home, to get his rifle and perhaps bring one of his ranch hands. But something in the quality of the shouts made him hesitate. There was desperation there, fear, and what sounded like pain. Against his better judgment, Tom urged Thunder forward, moving cautiously through the trees toward the source of the commotion. What he saw when he reached the clearing made his blood run cold. A young Native American man lay motionless beside the creek, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. His horse, a paint mare with distinctive markings, stood nearby, reins trailing in the water. The man's clothes were torn, and it was clear he had been shot while trying to cross the creek. But what made Tom's jaw clench were the 3 men on horseback who circled the wounded figure like vultures. Jake Wilson, a neighbor whose ranch bordered Tom's property to the south, sat astride his bay gelding with a rifle still smoking in his hands. Beside him were 2 men Tom recognized as drifters who had been causing trouble in Willowbrook for the past few weeks. Their faces showed no remorse, only a cold satisfaction at having brought down their prey. "Should have stayed on your own side of the valley," Jake was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "Now you know what happens when your kind tries to steal our cattle." The wounded man stirred slightly, trying to push himself up on one elbow. Blood continued to flow from his shoulder, staining the creek water pink where it pooled around him. His dark eyes met Tom's across the clearing, and in them Tom saw not the savage his neighbors claimed to fear, but simply a young man in desperate need of help. "Please," the wounded man whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of flowing water. "My son, waiting for me." Jake raised his rifle again, and Tom knew he had perhaps seconds to act. Every fiber of his frontier upbringing told him to stay hidden, to avoid getting involved in what would surely become a complicated situation. The tensions between the growing settlements and the local tribes had been escalating for months. Sheriff Carson had made it clear that he expected the ranchers to handle their own problems, and getting involved in what Jake would certainly claim was justified protection of property could bring serious consequences. But as Tom watched the wounded man struggle to stay conscious, another voice spoke louder than his caution. It was the voice his father had instilled in him during their long talks on the porch of their Ohio farmhouse, before disease and drought had driven the family west. It was the voice Sarah had strengthened through years of marriage, reminding him that character was measured not by what was easy, but by what was right when no one was watching. Tom spurred Thunder into the clearing. "That's enough, Jake," he called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "The man's down. No need for more killing." Jake turned his rifle toward Tom, his face twisted with anger and surprise. "Stay out of this, Harrison. This doesn't concern you." "Man bleeding by the creek concerns me plenty," Tom replied, dismounting slowly and keeping his hands visible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Especially when it's happening on land that borders mine. The 2 drifters exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with this new development. They had signed on for what they thought would be a simple intimidation job, not a confrontation with one of the valley's most respected ranchers. "He was stealing cattle," Jake insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Had to be stopped." Tom looked around the clearing, noting the absence of any cattle, stolen or otherwise. The wounded man's horse carried only a small bundle of what appeared to be herbs and roots, hardly the equipment of a cattle rustler. "Don't see any cattle, Jake. Just a man who needs a doctor." The wounded Native American looked up at Tom with eyes that held both gratitude and wariness. He had clearly expected no help from the white settlers, and Tom's intervention had caught him as much by surprise as it had Jake. "His name is Joseph Crowfeather," Tom said quietly. though he had no idea how he knew this. The wounded man nodded slightly, confirming what Tom had somehow intuited. "And he's got a son waiting for him." Jake's face darkened. "You're making a big mistake, Harrison. The whole valley's going to hear about this." "I expect they will," Tom replied. "Now you and your friends need to move along. I'll be taking Joe here to see Dr. Thompson." The standoff lasted what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Jake lowered his rifle and jerked his horse's head around. The two drifters followed his lead, and soon the three men were riding hard toward Willowbrook, leaving Tom alone with the wounded stranger. Tom knelt beside Joseph, assessing the damage. The bullet had passed through the shoulder, missing the bone but tearing muscle and causing significant blood loss. Without immediate medical attention, infection would set in within hours. "Can you ride?" Tom asked. Joseph nodded weakly. "Not far." Tom looked at Thunder, his magnificent stallion who had been his constant companion for 7 years. The horse represented not just transportation, but partnership, trust, and countless shared experiences. Thunder knew every inch of the ranch, could find his way home in the darkest night, and had saved Tom's life more than once by sensing danger before it became apparent. But looking at Joseph's pale face and the blood that continued to seep from his wound, Tom knew what he had to do. "Thunder here will get you to town," Tom said, helping Joseph to his feet. "He knows the way to Dr. Thompson's office. Just give him his head and he'll take you straight there." Joseph stared at him in disbelief. "You give me your horse?" "I'm lending him to you," Tom corrected, though he suspected he might never see Thunder again. "A man needs to get to his son." With considerable effort, Tom helped Joseph onto Thunder's back. The wounded man swayed dangerously for a moment, then found his balance. He looked down at Tom with an expression that seemed to contain years of unspoken communication. "Why?" Joseph asked simply. Tom thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Because it's what needs doing." Joseph gathered the reins in his good hand and looked toward the path that led to Willowbrook. Then he turned back to Tom one more time. "Joseph Crowfeather will remember," he said solemnly. "My people will remember." With that, he touched his heels to Thunder's sides and rode away, leaving Tom standing alone beside the creek with only Joseph's paint mare for company. As he watched his beloved horse disappear into the trees, carrying a wounded stranger toward an uncertain reception in town, Tom wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The paint mare, he discovered, was gentle and well-trained, though she clearly missed her master. Tom managed to fashion a makeshift bridle from rope and began the long ride home, knowing that Sarah would be waiting on the porch, wondering why he was late for dinner and riding a strange horse. But as the sun began to set over Clearwater Valley, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Despite the certain trouble his actions would bring, despite the questions he would have to answer and the neighbors he would have to face, he felt the deep satisfaction that comes from acting according to one's conscience rather than one's convenience. He had no way of knowing that Joseph Crowfeather would indeed reach Dr. Thompson, that Thunder would be carefully tended and fed, or that by morning, news of the white rancher who had given his horse to save a Native American's life would have spread throughout the Pine Ridge Reservation. He couldn't have imagined that elders would gather in council that very night, discussing a debt of honor that demanded repayment. And Tom Harrison certainly never could have predicted what would appear on the horizon the following day, when the thunder of hooves would announce the arrival of something unprecedented in the history of Clearwater Valley. But as he rode toward home through the gathering dusk, leading Joseph's paint mare and wondering how he would explain the day's events to his family, Tom knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had acted as the man his father had raised him to be, and whatever consequences followed, he would face them with the same quiet dignity that had guided his decision by the creek. The first stars were beginning to appear as Tom finally reached the homestead, where Sarah waited on the porch with a lantern in her hand and questions in her eyes. The real story, however, was just beginning. Sarah Harrison dropped the wooden spoon she had been stirring soup with when she saw her husband approaching through the twilight on an unfamiliar horse. The paint maré's distinctive markings caught the lamplight from the porch, and Sarah's experienced eye immediately recognized that this was not one of their animals. Tom's posture in the saddle told her everything she needed to know about the kind of day he'd had, even before she noticed that Thunder was nowhere to be seen. Anna appeared beside her mother, drawn by the unusual sight of her father returning home on a strange mount. At 13, she had inherited her parents' ability to read situations quickly, and the tension in her father's shoulders as he dismounted told her that something significant had happened during what should have been a routine fence repair. Tom secured the paint mare to the hitching post with practiced efficiency, but Sarah noticed the way his hands lingered on the animal's neck, the gentleness he showed as he checked her over for any signs of distress from the long ride. This was not the behavior of a man who had simply traded horses for convenience. "Where's Thunder?" Anna asked before Sarah could form the question herself. Tom looked up at his daughter, then at his wife, and Sarah saw something in his expression that she had witnessed only a few times during their marriage. It was the look he wore when he had made a decision that he knew was right, but that would bring consequences neither of them could fully predict. "I gave him to someone who needed him more than I did today," Tom said simply, his voice carrying the weight of finality that Sarah had learned to recognize over their years together. Sarah stepped down from the porch, her practical nature immediately asserting itself, even as her heart began to process what her husband was telling her. Thunder represented more than transportation or even companionship. The stallion was worth more money than most families in Clearwater Valley saw in 2 years, and he had been Tom's pride since the day he had broken the young colt with patience and determination that had become legendary among the local ranchers. "Tom Harrison," she said quietly, using the full name that meant she expected complete honesty. "You need to tell me exactly what happened today." Anna settled herself on the porch steps, recognizing the tone that meant the adults were about to have one of their serious conversations. But instead of being sent inside, she found herself included as Tom began to recount the events at the creek. Sarah had always insisted that their daughter understand the realities of the world they lived in, including the difficult decisions that sometimes had to be made when principle collided with practicality. Tom's account was methodical and thorough, leaving out no detail of his encounter with Jake Wilson and the wounded Native American man. Sarah listened without interrupting, though her expression grew increasingly grave as she began to understand the implications of her husband's actions. When he finished speaking, the three of them sat in silence while the evening sounds of the ranch settled around them. "Jake Wilson will be talking to everyone in Willowbrook by tomorrow morning," Sarah finally said, her voice steady despite the concern Tom could see in her eyes. "I expect he will. Sheriff Carson won't like getting pulled into something like this." "No, he won't." Anna looked back and forth between her parents, trying to understand the undercurrents of what was being discussed. "But Papa did the right thing," she said, with the certainty that only a 13-year-old could muster. "You can't just let someone die when you can help them." Tom reached over and squeezed his daughter's hand. "That's what I thought too, little bird." Sarah stood and brushed dust from her apron, a gesture Tom recognized as her way of organizing her thoughts before making important decisions. She had always been the practical one in their partnership, the person who thought through consequences while Tom acted on instinct. But she had also been the one to encourage his better angels when he was tempted to take the easier path. "The paint mare," she said, looking over at the horse that stood patiently by the post. "She's well cared for. Good muscle tone, clean coat, shoes in good repair. Whoever owns her knows horses." "Joseph Crow Feather," Tom said. "That's the man's name." Sarah nodded slowly. "I've heard that name." Mary Thompson mentioned it when she was talking about the native families who come to her husband for medical care. Said he was one of the few who spoke English well enough to translate for the others. This information settled something in Tom's mind that he hadn't realized was unsettled. Knowing that Joseph had a reputation in the community, even a small one, made the man more real somehow, less like the faceless enemy that people like Jake Wilson preferred to imagine. "What do you think Dr. Thompson will do?" Anna asked. "His job," Sarah replied firmly. Emily Thompson didn't marry a doctor so she could turn away people who need help. And her husband took an oath that doesn't have exceptions for the color of a person's skin. Tom felt a surge of gratitude for his wife's unwavering moral clarity. In a world where it was easy to find excuses for choosing convenience over conscience, Sarah had always been his anchor to what mattered most. She might worry about the consequences of his actions, but she would never ask him to regret doing what he believed was right. The next morning brought visitors earlier than any of them had expected. Tom was feeding the horses when he heard the sound of multiple riders approaching at a pace that suggested urgency rather than leisure. He set down the feed bucket and walked toward the front of the house, where Sarah had already emerged onto the porch with a rifle held casually but visibly in her hands. Sheriff Bill Carson led the group, his badge catching the morning sunlight. As he reined in his horse near the hitching post, behind him rode Jake Wilson and the two drifters from the previous day, along with Mayor Frank Miller and 3 other men Tom recognized as prominent citizens of Willowbrook. The delegation had the formal air of an official inquiry, but the presence of Jake and his companions suggested something more confrontational. "Morning, Tom," Sheriff Carson said, touching the brim of his hat in acknowledgement of Sarah's presence on the porch. "Need to ask you some questions about yesterday's events." "I figured you might," Tom replied, keeping his voice level and his hands visible. "What would you like to know?" Jake Wilson urged his horse forward, his face flushed with the kind of righteous anger that Tom had seen too often in men who confused their personal grievances with public justice. "Tell him about how you helped a cattle thief escape, Harrison. Tell him how you gave aid and comfort to someone who was stealing from honest ranchers." Sheriff Carson held up a hand to silence Jake, but his expression made it clear that he shared at least some of the man's sentiments. "Jake here says you interfered with his lawful protection of property. Says you helped a Native American who was caught stealing cattle get away from justice." Tom looked around the assembled group, noting the way they had positioned themselves to surround the house and cut off any easy retreat. These men had come prepared for resistance, which told him everything he needed to know about how the story had been told in town. "I helped a wounded man get to a doctor," Tom said clearly. "Didn't see any stolen cattle yesterday. Didn't see any evidence of cattle stealing. Saw a man bleeding by the creek who said he had a son waiting for him." "You gave him your horse," Mayor Miller interjected. "Your valuable stallion. Why would you do that for a stranger unless you knew him already? Unless maybe you'd been working with him?" The implication hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, dangerous and capable of spreading quickly, if not contained. Tom felt Sarah's presence behind him, solid and supportive, and drew strength from her quiet confidence. "I gave him my horse because he needed to get to town before he bled to death," Tom replied. "Same reason I'd give any of you my horse if you were shot and needed help." Jake laughed harshly. "That's a lie, and we all know it. No white man gives away a horse worth more than most people's houses to help some Indian unless there's something in it for him." Anna had appeared on the porch beside her mother, and Tom saw her young face struggling to understand how helping someone could be turned into evidence of wrongdoing. The innocence in her expression reminded him of what was at stake in this moment. The men surrounding his house weren't just questioning his actions. They were challenging the values he wanted to pass on to his daughter. "Sheriff," Tom said, addressing Carson directly, "I'm curious about something. Did Dr. Thompson treat the wounded man? Is Joseph Crowfeather alive?" Carson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Doc Thompson says the man was badly wounded but stable when he left town this morning. Says someone had already paid for his medical care. This information surprised everyone present, including Tom. He had given Joseph his horse without any thought of payment, or even the possibility that the wounded man would survive long enough to reach medical attention. Who paid? Sarah asked. From the porch, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Thompson wouldn't say, Carson replied. Professional discretion, he called it. Jake's face darkened further. Don't matter who paid. Point is, Harrison here helped a criminal escape justice. That makes him an accessory to whatever that Indian was planning. Tom stepped forward, his patience finally reaching its limit. Jake, you keep talking about cattle stealing, but I notice you haven't mentioned filing a report with the sheriff here about any missing livestock. You haven't shown anyone any evidence that Joseph Crowfeather took anything from you or anyone else. All you've got is the fact that you shot an unarmed man and I kept you from finishing the job. The accusation hit its mark. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Sheriff Carson's sharp command stopped him before he could draw. Enough, Carson barked. Nobody's drawing iron on my watch. Mayor Miller cleared his throat, attempting to restore some semblance of official procedure to what was rapidly becoming a personal confrontation. Tom, the thing is, we need to know where your loyalties lie. The tensions between the settlement and the reservation have been growing, and we can't have people taking sides against their own community. My loyalty is to doing what's right. Tom replied, always has been. What's right, said one of the other townsmen, is protecting our families and our property from people who want to take what we've worked for. Sarah stepped down from the porch, still carrying her rifle, but now holding it in a way that suggested readiness rather than mere caution. What's right, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had helped build this community. From nothing is not letting fear turn us into the kind of people who shoot wounded men by creeks. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with various members of the delegation attempting to extract some kind of confession or promise from Tom that would satisfy their need to see him properly chastened for his actions. But Tom's responses remained consistent. He had helped a wounded man reach medical care, and he would do the same thing again under similar circumstances. Finally, Sheriff Carson seemed to recognize that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Without producing the results that Jake Wilson and his supporters had hoped for. Tom, I'm going to need you to stay close to the ranch for the next few days while we sort this all out. Don't want any more incidents while folks are stirred up. Tom nodded his agreement, though both he and Carson understood that this was more about giving the community time to calm down than about any real legal restriction on Tom's movements. As the delegation prepared to leave, Jake Wilson rode his horse close to where Tom stood. This isn't over, Harrison, he said quietly enough that the others couldn't hear. You picked the wrong side, and before this is finished, you're going to wish you'd minded your own business. Tom met his gaze steadily. I picked the only side I know how to pick, Jake, the one that lets me sleep at night. After the men had ridden away, Tom and Sarah stood together in their yard, watching the dust settle and trying to process what had just occurred. Anna joined them, slipping her hand into her father's with the automatic trust that children show parents who have proven themselves worthy of faith. Are we in trouble, Papa? She asked. Tom considered the question seriously. The truth was that they probably were in trouble, though not the legal kind that Sheriff Carson had implied. The real trouble would come from being isolated within their own community, from having neighbors who no longer trusted them, from trying to maintain a ranch and a family in an environment where their fundamental values put them at odds with the people around them. But looking down at his daughter's upturned face, Tom realized that the alternative would have been far worse. How could he have explained to Anna that he had walked away from a wounded man because helping him might bring social consequences? How could he have taught her that principles were less important than popularity? "We might be," he told her honestly, "but we're not in the wrong kind of trouble." Sarah squeezed his arm, and Tom knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. They had built their life in Clearwater Valley through hard work, integrity, and mutual support, and those same qualities would see them through whatever consequences flowed from his decision by the creek. What none of them could have predicted was that as they stood together in their yard, discussing the morning's confrontation and trying to plan for an uncertain future, riders were already moving across the landscape toward their ranch. These riders carried no anger or accusations, no demands for explanations or threats of retribution. Instead, they carried something that would transform not only Tom's understanding of what he had done, but the entire community's perception of what it meant to act with honor in a world too often governed by fear and prejudice. The thunder of their approach would soon echo across Clearwater Valley, announcing the arrival of something unprecedented in the bitter history between the settlers and the indigenous peoples of Montana. And at the center of it all would be a simple truth that Tom Harrison had acted upon without thinking. Sometimes doing what's right creates ripples that extend far beyond anything we can imagine. The isolation began subtly, like frost forming on windows before dawn. Mrs. Henderson, who had always waved cheerfully when Tom rode past her property on his way to town, now found urgent tasks that required her immediate attention whenever he appeared on the horizon. The blacksmith, previously eager to discuss horse breeding and share local gossip, suddenly became efficient and businesslike during Tom's visits, completing transactions with minimal conversation and avoiding eye contact. At the general store, conversations died when Tom entered, replaced by the kind of weighted silence that spoke louder than any accusation. Mrs. Clark, the store owner's wife, counted his change twice and handed it to him without the usual pleasantries about weather or family news. Even children seemed to sense the shift, clustering closer to their mothers when the Harrison family appeared in town. Sarah felt the change most acutely during her weekly visits to the quilting circle that met in the back room of the church. These gatherings had been her primary source of community connection, a place where women shared news, advice, and the kind of mutual support that made frontier life bearable. But now the conversations became stilted when she arrived, and several members found reasons to leave earlier than usual. Anna discovered the new reality during her first trip to town since the incident at the creek. She had always looked forward to these expeditions, particularly the opportunity to browse the limited selection of books at the general store and perhaps catch glimpses of other children her age. But the stares that followed her family through the streets made her acutely aware that something fundamental had changed in their relationship with the community. The economic pressure began within days. 3 families who had contracted with Tom to provide beef for winter canceled their orders without explanation. The bank, which had always been accommodating about extending credit for ranch improvements, suddenly required immediate payment for outstanding loans. Most significantly, the cattle buyers who typically visited the valley each fall sent word that they would not be purchasing livestock from Sunrise Ranch this season. Tom absorbed each blow without complaint, but Sarah could see the weight accumulating in the set of his shoulders and the lines that appeared around his eyes. The ranch had always operated on thin margins, and the sudden loss of income streams threatened not just their current comfort, but their ability to maintain the property through the coming winter. Jake Wilson's campaign against the Harrison family took on an increasingly organized character. He had always been a man who thrived on grievance and righteous anger, but now he had found a cause that resonated with enough people to give him real influence. He held informal meetings at the saloon, where whiskey loosened tongues and hardened opinions about the threat that sympathizers posed to community safety. The stories grew in the telling, as stories always did when fear and alcohol mixed in equal proportions. Joseph Crow Feather became a known cattle thief rather than a wounded man. Tom's assistance transformed from an act of mercy into evidence of collaboration with hostile forces. Thunder, the magnificent stallion that Tom had raised and trained, became payment for unspecified services rendered to enemies of the settlement. Dr. Emily Thompson found herself caught between professional obligations and community pressure. When Jake Wilson arrived at her clinic demanding information about her husband's treatment of the wounded Native American, she had always prided herself on maintaining strict confidentiality about patient care. But Jake's insistence that the community had a right to know about potential threats tested her resolve. "The man was shot," she told Jake firmly, standing in the doorway of the clinic with her arms crossed. "My husband treated his wounds and released him when he was stable enough to travel. That's all the information I'm authorized to share." Jake's face reddened with frustration. "This isn't about patient privacy, Doc. This is about community safety. We need to know if Harrison was working with that Indian, if there are plans for more trouble." "Then I suggest you ask Mr. Harrison directly," Emily replied. "But you won't." "Get medical information from this clinic without a court order." The confrontation ended without resolution, but Jake's persistence made it clear that the pressure on anyone who had shown sympathy for Tom's actions would only intensify. Dr. Thompson himself began receiving pointed questions about his oath to treat all patients equally, with several prominent citizens suggesting that some circumstances might justify exceptions to medical ethics. Meanwhile, at the Pine Ridge Reservation, word of the white rancher's sacrifice had spread through the community, with the speed that important news always traveled among people who depended on each other for survival. Joseph Crow Feather had arrived home weak from blood loss but alive, leading thunder and carrying a story that challenged everything many tribal members believed about the settlers' capacity for honor. Chief Robert Running Bear called a council meeting for the evening of Joseph's return. The chief was a man of considerable wisdom and experience, someone who had navigated the treacherous waters of treaty negotiations and territorial disputes while maintaining his people's dignity and cultural identity. He listened carefully as Joseph recounted his encounter with the white rancher, asking detailed questions about Tom's demeanor and motivations. "This man Harrison," the chief said when Joseph had finished his account, "he gave you his most valuable possession to save." "Your life?" Without hesitation, Joseph confirmed. "And he asked nothing in return, no promise of repayment, no guarantee of safety. He saw that I was wounded and acted to preserve life." An elderly woman named Mary Singing Bird, one of the most respected voices in the tribal council, spoke from her place beside the fire. "In our tradition, such an action creates a debt that must be acknowledged, not because the giver expects repayment, but because allowing generosity to go unrecognized diminishes the honor of both peoples." The discussion that followed lasted well into the night, with various members of the council sharing perspectives on how best to respond to Tom's unexpected kindness. Some argued for caution, pointing out that previous attempts at friendship with settlers had often ended in disappointment or betrayal. Others felt that Tom's actions represented an opportunity to demonstrate that honor could exist between peoples regardless of the conflicts that divided their communities. Samuel Crow Feather, Joseph's teenage son, listened to the debate with the intensity of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered by recent events. He had grown up hearing stories of white settlers who took land without permission, who broke treaties when convenient, and who viewed native peoples as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings deserving of respect. But his father's account of Tom Harrison suggested that such generalizations, while often accurate, did not encompass every individual. "What would my grandfather have done?" Samuel asked during a lull in the conversation, referring to a legendary warrior who had died fighting to protect tribal lands, but who had also been known for his wisdom and sense of justice. Chief Running Bear smiled at the young man's question. "Your grandfather would have said that honor recognizes honor, regardless of the color of skin or the language spoken. He would have said that when someone risks everything to preserve life, that action deserves acknowledgement. As dawn approached, the council reached a consensus that surprised even some of its own members. They would respond to Tom Harrison's gesture with one of their own, something that would demonstrate the depth of their gratitude while also sending a clear message to both communities about the values that truly mattered. The plan they developed was ambitious and unprecedented. Never before had the Pine Ridge community taken such dramatic action to honor a white settler. But never before had a white settler shown such disregard for personal consequences in order to preserve native life. While the tribal council planned their response, Tom continued his daily routine of ranch work, despite the mounting isolation and economic pressure. The cattle still needed tending, fences still required repair, and the ordinary demands of frontier life continued regardless of community sentiment. But each day brought new challenges as suppliers became reluctant to extend credit and neighbors found reasons to avoid cooperation that had previously been routine. Sarah managed the household with the efficiency that had always characterized her approach to frontier living, but she found herself making careful calculations about resources that had never required such attention. The sudden loss of income meant that luxuries like store-bought flour and sugar would have to be rationed, and the family would need to rely more heavily on their own garden and preserved foods to get through the winter. Anna threw herself into her studies with renewed intensity, perhaps sensing that education represented a path toward a future that might be different from the constrained present her family now faced. She read every book in their small collection multiple times and began helping her mother with increasingly complex household tasks, maturing rapidly under the pressure of their changed circumstances. The pressure reached a new level when Sheriff Carson returned to the ranch with a formal complaint filed by Jake Wilson. The document, signed by several prominent citizens, accused Tom of providing material support to hostile elements and requested a formal investigation into his activities. While Carson made it clear that he considered the complaint largely political theater, he was obligated to conduct interviews and gather evidence. "Tom, I need you to understand that this is serious," Carson said as they sat on the front porch of the Harrison home. "Jake's got enough signatures on this petition to force the territorial governor to take notice. That means investigators from outside the county, federal oversight, the whole apparatus." Tom nodded slowly, recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond local politics into something that could have lasting legal consequences. "What do they want from me?" "Complete account of your relationship with Native individuals, details about any previous contacts, explanation of your decision-making process," Carson read from his notes. "They're also requesting permission to search your property for evidence of ongoing collaboration." Sarah stepped onto the porch carrying a tray with coffee and biscuits, her way of demonstrating that hospitality remained important regardless of circumstances. "Sheriff, do you believe my husband is collaborating with anyone to harm this community?" Carson accepted the coffee gratefully and took a moment before responding. "Ma'am, I've known Tom Harrison for 8 years. I've seen how he treats his neighbors, how he conducts his business, how he raises his daughter. If Tom's guilty of anything, it's being too decent for his own good." "But you still have to investigate," Tom said. "I still have to investigate," Carson confirmed. "Politics is politics, and when enough people demand action, the law has to respond. But Tom, I want you to know that you've got friends in this community too. People who remember when you helped them bring in harvest during the drought, when you shared water during the dry spell, when you rode through a blizzard to fetch Dr. Thompson for the Miller baby." This information provided some comfort, but it also highlighted how deeply the community had divided over Tom's actions. Neighbors who had worked together for years to survive the challenges of frontier life now found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that seemed to have no middle ground. The investigation, when it came, was thorough but revealed exactly what Tom's supporters had expected. No evidence of wrongdoing, no indication of ongoing relationships with tribal members, no suggestion of any agenda beyond helping a wounded man reach medical care. But the process itself served Jake Wilson's purposes by keeping the controversy alive and maintaining pressure on anyone who might be tempted to show similar independence of judgment. As autumn deepened and the first frost appeared on the mountain peaks, the Harrison family settled into a routine of quiet resilience. They worked their land, cared for their animals, and maintained their standards despite the social and economic isolation that surrounded them. Tom continued to believe that his actions had been correct, but he began to worry about the long-term consequences for his wife and daughter. What none of them knew was that riders had been moving across the landscape for days, following trails that wound through hidden valleys and across ridges that few settlers had ever seen. These riders carried with them something that would transform the entire controversy from a local dispute into a story that would be remembered for generations. The morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant mountains seem close enough to touch. Tom was repairing a section of corral fence when Sarah called to him from the house, her voice carrying an urgency that made him drop his tools and hurry toward her. "Tom," she said, pointing toward the eastern horizon, "you need to see this." Anna had already climbed onto the porch roof for a better view, and her excited voice drifted down to her parents. "Papa, there must be 100 horses coming this way." Tom shaded his eyes against the morning sun and felt his breath catch in his throat. Moving across the valley like a river of muscle and mane came the largest herd of wild horses he had ever seen, their hoofbeats creating a thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. The approaching herd created a sound unlike anything Tom had ever experienced. It wasn't simply the rhythm of hooves against earth, but something deeper and more primal, a percussion that seemed to resonate in his chest and make his heartbeat synchronize with the thunderous cadence. As the horses drew closer, he could distinguish individual animals within the flowing mass, pintos and bays, chestnuts and blacks, each magnificent in its own right, but made extraordinary by their collective movement across the landscape. Sarah joined him in the yard, wiping her hands on her apron with the automatic gesture of someone preparing for unexpected company. Anna scrambled down from the roof with the agility of youth, her eyes wide with wonder at the spectacle unfolding before their home. None of them spoke as the herd approached, each absorbed in trying to comprehend what they were witnessing. At the front of the herd rode a figure that gradually resolved into recognizable form as the distance closed. Joseph. Crow Feather sat straight in his saddle despite the bandages visible beneath his shirt, his recovered strength evident in the confident way he guided his mount. Beside him rode an older man whose bearing spoke of authority and wisdom, his long hair braided with feathers and beads that caught the morning sunlight. But it was the horse that Joseph rode that made Tom's throat tighten with emotion. Thunder moved with the same fluid grace that had made him such a joy to ride, his black coat gleaming and his white blaze brilliant against the darker background. The stallion appeared healthy and well cared for, but more than that, he seemed to understand the significance of this moment in ways that transcended ordinary animal awareness. The herd slowed as it approached the ranch buildings, individual horses spreading out across the pasture in a display that showcased their variety and quality. These were not the half-wild Mustangs that occasionally wandered down from the high country, but prime breeding stock, animals that represented generations of careful selection and training. Their presence transformed the Harrison Ranch from a modest cattle operation into something that resembled the legendary horse farms of Kentucky or Virginia. Joseph dismounted first, moving with careful deliberation that revealed his shoulder was still healing. The older man followed, his movements fluid despite his apparent age, and Tom found himself looking into eyes that held depths of experience and understanding that commanded immediate respect. "Tom Harrison," Joseph said, his voice carrying clearly. Across the yard, I present Chief Robert Running Bear of the Pine Ridge people." The chief stepped forward with dignity that needed no ceremony or announcement to establish its authority. When he spoke, his English was precise and formal, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to speaking words that would be remembered and repeated. "Tom Harrison," Chief Running Bear said, "you gave my son the gift of life when death circled like a vulture. This debt cannot be repaid with words or promises, but only with actions that match the generosity of spirit you showed beside the creek." Tom felt suddenly self-conscious about his work clothes and the dirt under his fingernails, unprepared for this level of formality and ceremony. But Sarah stepped beside him, her presence steadying, and Anna moved to his other side, creating a family unit that faced this unprecedented moment together. "Chief Running Bear," Tom said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect, "I'm honored by your visit. Joseph needed help, and any decent person would have done the same thing." The chief smiled slightly, the expression transforming his weathered features and revealing the humor that lurked beneath his serious demeanor. Any decent person might have wanted to help. Few would have given away their most precious possession to a stranger of different skin color, knowing that their own community would condemn such generosity. Joseph led Thunder forward, the stallion moving with the eager energy of a horse returning to familiar territory. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he reached out to touch the animal's neck, feeling the warmth and strength that he had missed during the weeks of separation. "Thunder has been treated as befits a horse of his quality," Joseph said. "He has run with our finest mares, eaten the best grass our pastures provide, and been groomed by hands that understand his value. But a horse belongs with the man who raised him, just as honor belongs with the man who demonstrated it." Chief Running Bear gestured toward the herd that had spread across Tom's pasture, their presence transforming the entire landscape. "These horses are our gift to you, Tom Harrison. Each has been chosen for strength, intelligence, and bloodlines that trace back to the great herds that once covered these plains. They are not payment for your kindness, because kindness cannot be purchased. They are recognition that honor calls to honor across all boundaries that men create." Tom stared at the assembled horses, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was being offered. There were stallions that would improve any breeding program, mares that could produce champions, and young horses with potential that would take years to fully realize. The value represented by this herd exceeded anything he could have earned from cattle ranching in a lifetime. "Chief, I can't accept this," he said finally. "What I did doesn't deserve such generosity." "What you did," the chief replied firmly, "was risk everything you had built in this valley to preserve the life of someone you had never met. You knew that helping Joseph would bring consequences from your community, but you chose to act according to conscience rather than convenience. Such choices deserve recognition, not because they are rare, but because they should not be rare." Sarah stepped forward, her practical nature asserting itself even in the face of such extraordinary circumstances. "Chief Running Bear, we're deeply honored by your generosity, but we need to understand what accepting such a gift would mean. There are people in our community who already question our loyalty, and this might make those tensions worse." The chief nodded approvingly at her directness. "You speak wisely, Sarah Harrison. There will indeed be those who see our gift as evidence of conspiracy rather than gratitude. But there will also be those who recognize that we honor your husband because his actions honored our people. The choice of how to interpret generosity says more about the interpreter than about the generous." Anna had been listening to this exchange with the intense concentration of someone trying to understand adult complexities that seemed both fascinating and overwhelming. Finally, she spoke up with the clarity that children sometimes bring to complicated situations. "Papa," she said, "these horses are beautiful, and the chief is right that you deserve recognition for doing what was right. But more than that, accepting them would show everyone that native people and settlers can respect each other when we act with honor. Tom looked down at his daughter, struck by her insight into the broader implications of this moment. Anna was right that accepting the gift would make a statement about the possibility of mutual respect between communities that had been taught to see each other as enemies. But she was also right that such a statement would bring its own challenges. Chief Running Bear had brought more than horses to the Harrison Ranch. Behind the mounted warriors who had guided the herd rode several women and elderly men, people whose presence indicated that this was more than a simple delivery of livestock. They had come to witness and participate in a ceremony that would formalize the relationship between Tom's family and the Pine Ridge community. One of the women, introduced as Mary Singing Bird, approached Sarah with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. She carried a bundle wrapped in deer hide, which she presented with words spoken in her native language before switching to English. "This blanket was woven by my grandmother and her grandmother before her," Mary said. "It has covered babies during their first nights on Earth and warriors during their final journeys to the spirit world. We offer it to your family as recognition that some bonds transcend the boundaries that divide peoples." Sarah accepted the blanket with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that she was receiving something of inestimable cultural and personal value. The weaving was intricate beyond anything she had ever seen, with patterns that seemed to tell stories and colors that had been drawn from plants and minerals, using knowledge passed down through generations. Meanwhile, Samuel Crow Feather had approached Anna with the shy formality of a teenager meeting someone his own age from a different world. He carried a smaller bundle, which he presented with words carefully chosen in English. "These are books," he said, unwrapping volumes that Tom recognized as advanced texts on mathematics, natural philosophy, and literature. "My father learned to read from missionary teachers, and he taught me. But learning should not stop with one family or one people. We hope you will find knowledge in these pages that serves you well." Anna accepted the books with genuine excitement, immediately opening one to examine the contents. The gesture represented more than an exchange of gifts. It acknowledged her as an individual worthy of respect and education, someone whose intellectual development mattered to people she had never met. But even as these exchanges unfolded with ceremonial dignity, Tom was acutely aware that their activities were being observed. Smoke from the morning cooking fires in Willowbrook was visible in the distance, and he knew that news of the large gathering at his ranch would spread quickly through the community. By afternoon, every resident of the valley would know that the Harrison family had received visitors from Pine Ridge, and speculation about the purpose of such a visit would fuel conversations for weeks. Joseph approached Tom with something approaching solemnity, carrying an object wrapped in soft leather. When he unwrapped it, Tom saw that it was a saddle of extraordinary craftsmanship, decorated with beadwork and silver concos that reflected the morning light like captured stars. "This saddle was made by our finest craftsmen," Joseph explained. "It was created specifically for Thunder, measured to fit his build, and designed to honor his spirit. A horse of his quality deserves equipment that recognizes his worth." Tom ran his hands over the leather, feeling the smoothness that came from careful preparation and the subtle decorations that transformed a utilitarian object into a work of art. The saddle represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor, and its presentation to him indicated a level of respect that went far beyond simple gratitude for medical assistance. Chief Running Bear raised his hand, and the conversations that had been occurring throughout the gathering gradually subsided as people turned their attention to him. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the assembled group, ensuring that everyone present would remember his words. "Tom Harrison," the chief said, "we have traveled far to bring these gifts, but the distance we have covered is small compared to the distance you traveled when you chose to see Joseph Crow Feather as a human being rather than an enemy. That journey, from fear to compassion, from suspicion to trust, is one that all people must make if we are to share this land in peace." The chief paused, looking around at the assembled horses, the watching faces, and the vast landscape that surrounded them all. These horses will remind you daily that kindness creates bonds stronger than any chain, that honor recognizes honor regardless of the language spoken or the color of skin. But more than that, they will serve as proof to your community that our people value the same virtues they claim to value: courage, generosity, and protection of the innocent. Tom felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, like a heavy cloak. Accepting these horses would transform him from a simple rancher into something more complex, a symbol of possibility for better relations between communities, a bridge between worlds that had been taught to distrust each other, and a target for those who preferred the simplicity of mutual hatred to the challenges of mutual respect. But looking at Thunder, at the magnificent herd spread across his pasture, at the faces of people who had traveled far to honor his simple act of human decency, Tom realized that the choice had already been made. He had crossed a line when he gave his horse to Joseph, and there was no going back to the uncomplicated existence he had known before. "Chief Running Bear," he said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt, "I accept your gifts with gratitude and the promise that they will be cared for with the respect they deserve. More than that, I promise that the friendship you offer will be honored and protected, regardless of the consequences." The formal ceremony concluded with the sharing of food that the Pine Ridge delegation had brought, creating an atmosphere of celebration that contrasted sharply with the tensions that had dominated Tom's life for the past weeks. But even as he participated in the festivities, Tom was aware that riders had appeared on the ridges surrounding his property, distant figures who were undoubtedly observing and reporting on everything they witnessed. By the time the delegation prepared to leave, taking most of the herd with them, but leaving behind 24 of the finest horses as permanent additions to Tom's ranch, word had already reached Willowbrook about the unprecedented gathering. Jake Wilson and his supporters would use this development as definitive proof of Tom's disloyalty, while others might see it as evidence that peaceful coexistence was possible between communities that had been artificially divided by fear and misunderstanding. As the Pine Ridge riders departed, their departure as spectacular as their arrival had been, Tom stood with his family in their transformed yard. The horses that remained grazed peacefully in pastures that had never held such valuable livestock, their presence a constant reminder that a single act of compassion had created consequences beyond anything he could have imagined. The real test, however, was yet to come. News of the gift would reach every corner of the territory within days, and the response from both native and settler communities would determine whether Tom's gesture had opened a door to better understanding, or simply made him a target for those who profited from maintaining ancient hatreds. Standing there with Thunder's reins in his hands and the weight of an unprecedented responsibility on his shoulders, Tom Harrison could not have predicted that his story would become legend, told around campfires and in schoolrooms for generations, to come as an example of what was possible when courage overcame fear and compassion triumphed over prejudice. 20 years had passed since that extraordinary morning when Chief Running Bear's delegation transformed Tom Harrison's modest ranch into something approaching legend. The boy who had once thrown rocks at wounded strangers was now Mayor Jacob Miller, a man whose perspective had been gradually reshaped by watching the consequences of choosing hatred over understanding. He stood on the main street of what was now called Harrison's Crossing, a thriving town that bore little resemblance to the fearful settlement of Willowbrook. The changes had not come quickly or easily. The years immediately following the horse gift had tested every resident of the valley, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about their assumptions and prejudices. Some, like Jake Wilson, had never accepted the new reality and had eventually moved on to communities where their narrow worldview faced less challenge. Others had gradually recognized that prosperity and security came not from isolation and suspicion, but from building bridges across the divides that separated peoples. Tom Harrison, now in his 60s with silver threading through his hair, stood beside the bronze statue that the town council had erected in this central square 5 years earlier. The sculpture depicted a man offering reins to a wounded figure, commemorating not just Tom's individual act of kindness, but the principle that compassion could triumph over fear when people possess the courage to act on their better instincts. The annual Friendship Festival filled the streets with families from both the surrounding ranches and the Pine Ridge community, their children playing together with the natural ease that came when prejudice was not passed down through generations. Anna Harrison, now a teacher at the integrated school that served students from both communities, watched her own children participate in games that would have been unimaginable during her youth. Samuel Crow Feather had grown into a respected leader who served as a liaison between the tribal council and the town government, facilitating the cooperation that had made Harrison's Crossing a model for peaceful coexistence throughout the territory. His friendship with Anna had evolved into a partnership that combined their shared commitment to education and community building. The horse breeding program that had grown from Chief Running Bear's gift had become the economic foundation of the entire valley's prosperity. The Harrison Ranch, now managed jointly by Tom and his son-in-law Samuel, produced horses that were sought after throughout the Western Territories for their quality, intelligence, and distinctive bloodlines that traced back to that memorable morning of reconciliation. Sarah Harrison, her hair now completely silver but her spirit as strong as ever, served as the unofficial historian of the community's transformation. She had documented the stories of individuals and families who had made the difficult journey from suspicion to acceptance, creating a record that would help future generations understand how fundamental change was possible when people chose courage over comfort. Dr. Emily Thompson, now elderly but still practicing medicine, had trained the first Native American doctor in the territory's history, a young woman who had overcome enormous obstacles to pursue her calling. The clinic that had once served only white settlers now provided care to anyone who needed it, embodying the principle that healing knew no boundaries of race or culture. Chief Running Bear, though no longer able to make the journey from Pine Ridge, sent annual messages through his grandson expressing his satisfaction that Tom Harrison's single act of conscience had grown into something that honored both peoples. The friendship between the communities had survived changes in leadership, economic fluctuations, and external pressures from those who preferred the old divisions. Sheriff Bill Carson, retired now and spending his days teaching young people about law enforcement, often reflected on how Tom's decision had ultimately made his job easier rather than more difficult. Crime rates had dropped significantly when the community stopped seeing enemies everywhere and began working together to address the real challenges they all faced. The children who had grown up in this transformed environment carried none of the inherited hatred that had poisoned earlier generations. They learned the history of conflict not as justification for continuing hostility, but as a cautionary tale about the costs of allowing fear to override humanity. They played together, learned together, and would eventually build families together, creating bonds that made future conflict increasingly unthinkable. Thunder had lived a long and honored life, becoming the foundation stallion for bloodlines that carried his intelligence and spirit to ranches throughout the West. When he finally passed, both communities mourned the loss of the horse whose journey from Tom to Joseph and back again had symbolized the possibility of trust between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the festival grounds, Tom walked among the families enjoying the celebration, marveling at how a single moment of moral clarity had rippled outward to create changes he never could have imagined. Children who had never known a world divided by racial hatred ran past him, their laughter carrying on the wind that still moved across the valley with the same gentle persistence it had shown for countless generations. The memorial garden beside the statue contained flowers planted by families from both communities, their mixed blooms creating a tapestry of color that reflected the diversity that had become the valley's greatest strength. Plaques honored those from both sides who had shown courage in building bridges across old divisions, recognizing that peace required ongoing effort from each generation. Mayor Miller approached Tom as the festival began winding down, carrying with him a letter that had arrived that morning from the territorial governor. The correspondence officially designated Harrison's Crossing as a model community for integration and cooperation, inviting delegations from other regions to study their methods and adapt their successes. "Tom," Miller said, extending his hand. In a gesture that would have been unthinkable during their younger years, "I wanted to thank you personally for showing us what was possible when someone chooses principle over popularity. This community exists because you had the courage to see beyond the fear that blinded the rest of us." Tom accepted the handshake warmly, remembering the angry young man who had once participated in Jake Wilson's campaigns of hatred. "We all played our part, Jacob. Change happened because good people were willing to examine their assumptions and choose growth over comfort." As families began departing for their homes, some traveling back to Pine Ridge while others headed to ranches and farms throughout the valley, Tom reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The wounded man by the creek had recovered fully and had become a bridge between worlds. The horse that had carried him to safety had lived to see his gift transform into something magnificent. The community that had once been defined by suspicion and fear had evolved into something that demonstrated humanity's capacity for growth and redemption. The stars were beginning to appear as Tom made his final walk through the emptying festival grounds. Tomorrow would bring the ordinary work of ranching and community building, the daily efforts required to maintain what had been achieved and continue growing toward even greater understanding. But tonight, as he looked up at the vast Montana sky that covered all peoples equally, Tom Harrison felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that a single moment of choosing what was right over what was easy had created something beautiful that would outlast them all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.